Interoperability is a can opener, so it allows smaller companies to interact on a level playing field.
Today, it is an absolute honor to have Lucas from the Free Software Foundation of Europe, one of the most fascinating interviews I've done on this podcast. Lucas comes forward and covers the Digital Markets Act, what it means, what it actually tries to do, the good and the bad of it, and he clears up probably like dozens of misconceptions along the way that many of us, including myself, have likely fallen victim to. He talks about regulation versus deregulation and what that means for free software, and not free as in beer, but free as in free code, the role of government in open source, digital sovereignty and open source collaboration, interoperability, and why that's actually very important to help fight big tech, and so much more. This is truly an expert in his field that's breaking things down so simply for people like me and probably a lot of you listening. And so enjoy this interview, and I hope you learn as much as I did. Hello, Lucas. Welcome to the podcast. And I always like to open it up by just asking who you are and what you do.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for opening this communication channel. So my name is Lucas. I have been working mainly on the legal field. I'm a postdoc researcher at an university in Germany, the Halle-Wittenberg University. But I also had a second hat. I work for the Free Software Foundation Europe as a legal project manager, and there I have been involved in several different policy and legal projects.
So I know a lot of our audience is based in Europe, but still the majority is in the US. So do you mind explaining a bit what the FSFE is for those who don't know what it is?
Absolutely. The FSFE is a charity, so it's a non-profit organization that empowers users to control technology. We have a sister organization in the US, the Free Software Foundation, but we are independent. While the FSF focus on the United States, the FSFE focus more on Europe. This is our main goal. And this is important because a lot of the work that the FSFE and FSF also in the United States, both of them do, is policy and legal work. And these two type of work, they are pretty much geographically restricted, right? So the US has this own legislation, and the different countries in the EU have also their own legislation. So it is good that we are focused on our jurisdictions. It gives us a better overview of the processes, the democratic process on each country. But the overall goal of both organizations is to promote and to protect the concept of free software. Here, when I'm saying free software, I use the term as a synonym of open source software, right? But free software, for those who are listening to this for the first time, refers to the freedoms of software, right? The four freedoms: the freedom to use, to study, to share, and to improve software. And for that, we divide our work. The FSFE divides it working in three main areas: public awareness, policy advocacy, and legal intervention. So when we talk about public awareness, we want to promote the concept of free software via educational public awareness campaigns and activities. But when we have to interact with policymakers, with decision makers, then we activate our policy people. And last but not least, we have also several activities for the legal sector. So we have legal interventions, we do strategic litigation, we organize one of the largest conferences related to legal and licensing issues related to free software. So basically, these are the three main activities or areas of activity that the Free Software Foundation Europe is involved. Very nice. And so where do you kind of fall into those three buckets? The last one? Yes. I mean, since we are a small organization, and I think this is also important to point out that the FSFE, and I think the FSF as well, we're not a super huge organization. The FSFE, if I remember correctly, we have 20 employees, but we have a very large network of volunteers. Volunteers is our core aspect that enables our work. So although we have 20 staffers, we have 13 groups, including local groups spread all over Europe. And there are a lot of volunteers in Italy, Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, Poland, yeah, you name it. And they are very active working for free software. And due to the limited size of staffers, I think everyone should do a little bit of everything. So I'm involved with public awareness, policy, but my core aspect is legal interventions. We have some legal activities that go into the bucket of public awareness. I have some other projects that also is related to legislative process, regulatory process, but legal is I spend most of my working time.
Very nice. And so the big thing right now that's being discussed and has been discussed for years at this point now is the DMA, the Digital Markets Act in Europe. Do you mind giving a very brief intro to the DMA? I talk about it with our audience, but if anyone's new and they are not in Europe, this might be fairly new for them.
Yes, thank you already for point this. Yes, the Digital Markets Act is a law oriented to regulate the digital markets. And when we talk about regulation, this topic is very broad, right? And people start already to think what is about regulation, right? Any type of industry, when it becomes important to a degree that millions of people are using this type of products and services that are being produced by a determined industry, it tends to regulation, right? Think about the pharmaceutical industry, right? Or think about the medical equipment industry. As soon as we start to use more and more X-rays type of equipment or equipment that involves nuclear energy, they are regulated. The automobile industry, we have regulations for safety, for security, regulates how roads should be built, what are the signalization of the roads. So this type of regulation, industry oriented type of regulation. The digital industry was an exception because the digital industry grown up very fast. So one of the characteristics that differentiate the digital industry from the other type of industry that it grow exponentially and very fast, right? So think about the internet, or even now with the emergence of chatbots and LLMs. In a matter of 2 or 3 years, billions of people are using these devices and these services and these products. And regulation for the digital have been a little bit lagging behind, right? So therefore, the European Union decided to take some steps in order to start regulating the industry. The DMA is not the only law. There are other laws as well trying to regulate the digital. I think everybody remember in 2016 when data protection was the buzzword of the moment, and EU had the GDPR, right? And then some moments later we had the AI Act, and also when we talk about platform regulation. So basically, we're talking about platforms, these very large corporations that they connect consumers from one side and business from other side, right? So think about Amazon, right? Amazon put together business that they want to sell things on their platform, and then consumers come in order to buy. Social media is another example. People come from one side, from other side. So when we are talking about platform, there are two main legislations in the European Union dedicated to regulate these platforms. There are the DSA, the Digital Service Act, and now the hero of our story, the Digital Markets Act. Digital Service Act regulate platforms on the content level, while the Digital Markets Act regulates platforms on the infrastructure level. So we are talking about infrastructure regulation. So this is a short introduction to the DMA.
Perfect. And yeah, we have a lot to dig into here, but I want to start with a very simple thing I see a lot. People hear regulation, and I almost have this instinct as well. And it's not inherently a positive thing in my head always. And I know especially in the US, for Americans, there's this deep held belief of, if you want to start a business, it should be as smooth as possible. So regulation has this negative association. So do you have a kind of an initial thing to say to people when they hear the concept of Europe, regulating tech companies, which I feel like for Americans can sometimes come across as a negative thing? What do you normally respond to that with?
I think regulation is a normal phenomena in any type of business that becomes too important, right? And I don't think that, although yes, I also agree that there is good and bad regulation, and one of the main aspects of my work at FSFE is also to identify regulation that can promote free software, but also there are regulation that can hinder free software in other aspects of our life. I don't
Can you
think
give
that
examples?
regulation. Yes, of course. So, well, let's think about legislation that put in place in the European Union concerning procurement of software. And this software, the legislation, gives the prevalence or gives an advantage or is biased towards proprietary software. This, in my opinion, is bad regulation, right? Regulation should be neutral, right? And free software and proprietary software, they should compete on the merits. But if a regulation gives an advantage to proprietary software, I would say that this is a pretty bad regulation, and this happens, right? This happens, and we have been seeing this a lot. And one of our core activities is called public money, public code, and we think that the public services, they should use more free software, right? It's toward bad regulation. We want the public sector to implement good regulation. On the context of DMA, and by any means, I mean that the DMA is a perfect regulation. No, we are very critical of several aspects of it, and we have engaged with decision makers to make this better, to increase the level of free software open standards on it. But I think that in relation to free software, there are several synergies. There are several aspects that we can say, yes, this can work, and if we go ahead, we can make positive change via regulation.
Got it. And yeah, sorry, I really want to nail this down before we get into the more
Yes.
technical aspects of the DMA. So public money, public code. Something, and when I'm asking these questions, I'm, of course, being an interviewer here and just so these aren't necessarily my views on things. But I covered the F-Droid situation pretty extensively, and I'm continuing to, and how, Google's locking down Android a little bit.
Yes.
And not that long ago, when the Trump administration started pulling a lot of funding, one of the funds they pulled impacted a lot of open source projects. And we did some coverage for this. And, overwhelmingly our community was like, oh, this is bad. We like our projects. But there were actually there was a little bit of pushback from people saying it's not the government's job to fund things. So I really just want to quickly maybe get your views on if somebody thinks that it's not really the government's job to fund open source projects, and neutrality means actually not funding anything, whether it's open source or proprietary. Just because I haven't actually asked someone who's more of an expert on this about it yet.
Yes. So, yeah, I also encountered this position a lot out there, and I respect them. However, I have a different kind of position. And I think the government, as anything in our society, it has a role, right? And and taking the history of United States, which I respect and I appreciate very much, I think the best things that the United States achieved, and this is my personal opinion, don't quote me, the FSFE on this. This is my personal opinion because, but I'm happy to share this. Is when the government money was involved in order to fund things that are really great. When they put the first man on the moon and many other things, it was involved. So I don't believe society only as a group of individuals doing their own things. I do believe that the government and this public money also represents something collectively, a collective effort. The beauty of the different free software communities is that different people from different backgrounds and with different mindsets, they come together to a common objective. And then that's why I think that we can agree on collectively, democratically, that there are some things that a higher institution should fund things or not. So I don't see the difference when we come to a non-profit organization, a foundation, and then we say, look, perhaps we should fund something that is good, a free software project, right? To come to a governmental agency, fostering, progress, fostering education, fostering wealth, and say, look, we need to fund some free software projects. I don't see the difference between involving the private and the public sector when we are building. Think about a park in your city. A park is something that puts people together. There's some greenery. We like to go there. We can walk with our dog. We can go with our family, spend some good time together, some quality time. And so this park can be involved public money there or can be private money involved. But the good thing is to have a park on your neighborhood. And I have this attitude towards free and open source as well. I think that free and open source, it is ethically and morally speaking, a good way of developing software. And then if we can get private money to do this, great. But if we can get public money, then it's also great. So yeah, would be my personal humble position on this.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And yeah, I always thought it was interesting because if you're a taxpayer, I don't know why there isn't this higher expectation that what your government does isn't transparent and they're not using more open source code. And it's only now that we're seeing the geopolitical space that Europe has always, in my view, seemed to be a little bit better than the US in terms of supporting open source projects. But now we're seeing Europe really ramp it up big time because of digital sovereignty, because now there's this big wake-up call. We can't trust big tech companies as much, especially if they're located in another country. And this is going all directions. US is scared of Chinese products. I guess Europe is also probably scared of Chinese products, but Europe is also a bit concerned about using US products. And now everyone's realizing, well, man, if we invested earlier on in maybe some, open source software that allows us to own our own stuff, have more digital sovereignty, then yeah. So a bit of a side tangent there, but I think it's a big wake-up call now people are seeing.
If I may, yes, I agree with you. But the beauty of open source and free software is the global collaboration, right? Is this boundless? And you said you covered F-Droid. I was talking also with F-Droid people, and they said, look, we have developers contributing to the project in South Asia, in Latin America, and they all come together and this is something that when there's this debate of sovereignty here in Europe, me myself, when I'm engaged with the DMA, I make sure to make this very clear, because some people that are involved in the DMA, they tended to take a very protectionist approach, and to create this this tension. I would say that we don't need North American product, we don't need a product from that region. I personally, when I'm involved with the FSFE in this type of conversations with decision makers or in the academia, I tended to rebuke this, saying that the discussion here is rather big tech versus small tech than US versus EU or EU versus China. I'm convinced that national borders they don't mean much in the context of free software. On the contrary, I do think that this borderless collaboration and communication is the way to go. However, I do think that when the term company, any company in anywhere in the world, and even here in Europe, a monopoly is a monopoly in the US, a monopoly is a monopoly in Europe, is a monopoly in Brazil. As soon as company they become big enough to become a monopoly in digital markets, nobody wins from this. Nobody. not the North American consumer, not the European consumer, not the Latin American consumer, nor the South African consumer. The beauty of free software is that we democratize access to knowledge, and monopolies, they put barriers to knowledge, right? And therefore, again, we are talking about bad and good regulation. So even now, it's not, I cannot answer for you with 100% sure that the DMA will become in the future a good or bad regulation. Right now, what I can say is that the Free Software Foundation Europe is working hard to make DMA a good regulation. So we don't want to exclude North American companies. On the contrary, what we want is that everyone should have the same type of access to digital markets. So leveling the playing field. We don't want monopolies. So, but for that, we need to fight in order to make this law, viable in this way.
Perfect. No, thank you very much for your insight there. I think you're on the money, and it's exactly the approach that I should have to it and everyone listening. It reminds me a lot of the discussions about banning platforms like TikTok because they're Chinese-based, but not for the fact that it's a big tech company that's implementing these crazy tracking measures, which if they were actually regulating that instead of the company itself and the origins of the company, then it would also sweep Google, Facebook, et cetera, all under that same rug as well. And this is a big issue that we see in the US. To pivot over to the DMA, so I want to first get a little breakdown from you because I don't think many people actually know what the DMA is supposed to do. There's a lot of misinformation out there. So why don't we just start with what is the DMA intended to do on a broad, like from a broad point of view? And then why don't you kind of give a bit of the main, if there's like maybe 3 to 5 core things that is really, trying to, I guess, zero in on.
Can I start with a small history?
Please do. Whatever you need. I know it's a big topic to kind of touch on. So,
okay. So as I was saying, the digital became free from regulation almost for 30 years. The main aspect of regulating the digital in the US and in the EU was tackling copyright and content moderation. This was the two main aspects of regulating the digital. And other areas of the digital, especially the infrastructure one, they were more regulated already into the kind of consolidated industry, which had its own regulation. It was the telecommunications industry. So when we wanted to talk about the infrastructure of the digital, we basically referred to telecommunications law. While when we wanted specifically to target digital companies, then we would be more concerned about e-commerce, perhaps copyright law, but we would not deal with the infrastructure that is needed for these companies to flourish, right? This situation started to change in 2016, more or less, in the US and also in the EU, when I already mentioned, when the first regulations about data protection started to emerge. And in Europe, the debate about regulating the main aspects of the infrastructure for digital happened in a series of antitrust enforcement by the European Commission against Google. There were several of antitrust, and antitrust here is a branch of law that regulates competition, commercial competition among companies. And there were several antitrust investigations and then enforcements done by the European Commission, which is the responsible for this type of investigation against Google. One of them is Google Android, where from 2013 until 2018, if I'm not mistaken, the listeners please can check online, but I'm pretty sure that it was between 2013 and 2018 when the European Commission started to analyze Google's commercial practice regarding their search engine, regarding Android as operating system, regarding their App Store. And they found that Google was involved in a series of anti-competitive practices. Relevant for free software, for example, Google imposed on smartphone manufacturers, device manufacturers, some agreements called anti-fork agreements. It means like, Google provide Android as free and open source, but if the manufacturers would like to implement Google set of apps, they should not fork Android and have their own fork. They should use the one that was compatible and accepted and approved by Google. So there was this compatibility issue. And the European Commission found that in 2018 that this practice were anti-competitive, and they imposed huge fines on Google, and then these fines were also confirmed by a court because Google appealed the decision. And I mentioned just one case, but there were several of them. Several against Google, several against Apple, several against Microsoft. Microsoft was the first tech company that the European Commission really focused on competition issues. The FSFE 20 years ago were involved in this as well. So taking it in consideration, this whole thing, especially Google Android, the European Commission and the European Union said, look, dealing with this only as a remedy measure, because competition law runs after companies. They don't impose obligations, beforehand. We needed to change our position. So we need to regulate them. But this is not something new per se. There was always a moment in a determined industry, in the automobile industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, in the medical equipment industry, that in a determined moment in time, society, the parliament, the government, they decided to say, okay, perhaps we need to start regulating them, right? It happens in 2018. There were some reports, very influential reports here in the European Union, saying that, okay, we needed to deal with these companies, but we will not regulate the market like the whole spectrum of the digital markets, like starting from A to Z, right? We needed to choose a layer of companies, if we will, that we needed to regulate. And they could do, for an example, they could say, we will deal with the smallest one. We will deal with the startups one. But they didn't choose them. They chose the layer of big tech. Therefore, the DMA aims to regulate only a very specific layer of the market. This is important because this law does not apply to everyone or to every company. They apply to only a handful of companies. And this handful of companies should be designated by the European Commission. The majority of the companies nowadays are North American. There are some Chinese and there are some European as well. Booking, for an example, in the case of DMA'S, Zalando, in the case of the DSA, there are some companies European as well. Perhaps this is what caused this resentment among North Americans that the DMA is an anti-American law, because the majority of the companies being regulated is North American. However, the big tech, the largest tech companies in the world, for good or bad, if people think that is a good thing, it's North American. But if people think that is a bad thing, this is North American. And the law applies to these companies. So they apply to Microsoft, Google, Apple, Amazon, Meta, but also TikTok and others. Which type of obligations they entail. So then, as soon as the European Commission said, look, this law should apply to this company, and then the European Commission also should determine to which services of these companies, right? And then there are a set of criteria, qualitative and quantitative criteria that the regulator should attend. For example, 45 millions of consumers in the European markets, right? So the company needed to be really huge. We are talking about a huge part of the market. When the company meets this threshold, then the law starts to apply to them. Well, then the type of services. We are talking about operating systems, search engines, browsers, app stores, cloud services, and social media. And so basically the most important type of services in digital markets, right? And last but not least, just to give you this follow-up introduction on the DMA, the type of obligations they intend. So the obligation to allow third-party to allow consumers to install and uninstall software on your devices, to allow the gatekeepers to provide access to third-party app stores, to provide data interoperability, so portability in real time. So these are the type of obligations that are involved in the DMA.
Very nice. And so what does it kind of look like right now? The follow-up is going to be, what are the things that you think are good and bad as the FSFE? Because you even hinted at not all of it being good. So what are kind of the main things right now that are really trying to be enforced through the DMA?
So today is an interesting day. The Commission just started an investigation on the cloud computing industry. Just today that we are speaking. But last year, the Commission already analyzed interoperability. Interoperability was a big element in the DMA. Commission is analyzing AI and access to AI in operating systems. Commission has
Do you mind quickly talking about why interoperability is in the DMA? Why is there this concept of interoperability being anti-competitive?
Absolutely. I
Very
think
quick.
this is a great question. Because this interoperability is a can opener in the DMA. I like to use this analogy, mainly because interoperability is marked by a paradox. Companies, when they are small, they love interoperability because they want their service to interact with the bigger platform. So as soon as your small company makes your service compatible with the one with the platform, the value of your service increase. Think about, if you have a MP3 player and then you can interact and download, music from the platform streaming. You are a smaller app store like F-Droid that you covered. You want F-Droid to be present in iOS devices. You want F-Droid to be present in Android devices, right? So when you are small, you really want to interact, to interoperate with the platform. However, as soon as your company start growing and become important to the, to the point that others wanted to start interacting with your platform, then the incentives change. And then you start to limit interoperability to the functions that you only want. So you start to be very picky, to the ones that you wanted to interact and not. I will give a very short, use case, if you will, before the DMA, because the FSFE was already pretty much involved in a very nice activity, which I love. It's called router freedom. We also want people to use their own routers, to install free software on their routers, to be able to choose their routers, to connect their routers to the internet service provider. But the internet service providers before the DMA, they didn't allow you to use your own router here in Europe. They wanted to provide only with their routers, very crappy routers with no security updates, with proprietary stuff where you could not, tweak or install anything. You could not set your own home network. So they limited interoperability. You wanted to have your free open source router. They said no, you have to use my router, and this is happening now. Let's go back again to DMA. When Google and Microsoft and Apple, they cherry pick and they say, I want to provide you with you to interoperate only here and only there. So Apple says, for an example, Apple, smaller app stores will not be available on iOS. In order for smaller app stores to be available, you have to provide a letter of credit of 1 billion euro. And for an example, you covered F-Droid, right? And then F-Droid Google can start saying, we will not allow side loading anymore. Although I know that they mitigated this policy a little bit, but they started to be nitty-picky on the interoperability. So interoperability is a can opener. So it allows smaller companies and smaller players to interact on a level playing field services with the larger platforms.
Beautifully stated. Yeah, thank you. I actually just put out today how WhatsApp just launched interoperability. And so there are already 2 live clients. I forgot what they're called. You might know them. But they are now interoperable with WhatsApp so that you can just contact the WhatsApp person without even technically needing a WhatsApp account. And it's pretty awesome because for someone like Signal, like this is pretty big for them, and it opens up a big use case for Signal. And now, instead of just ignoring people or forcing them to move to Signal, which I guess it does kind of suck because it loses one of the main selling points of like, well, you should move completely to Signal, but it still allows you to message them and then you don't have to create a WhatsApp account. Some people were complaining that they don't want to talk with WhatsApp people, but I think they're kind of missing the broader point here. So I think you said it very well. So that's one part of the DMA, this can opener. You have, interoperability. I cut you off, so please go ahead and continue. What else you're kind of chasing after with the DMA?
Yes. So, and interoperability is so important in DMA that academics and they tend to classify interoperability into 2 types of interoperability: the vertical one and the horizontal one. Your example of WhatsApp is a perfect example of horizontal interoperability, where 2 types of services that are the same messaging type of services, they should interact with one another. So this is called horizontal interoperability. But also there is this vertical interoperability when, 2 type of services need to interact in order to communicate. For example, you want your payment system to access the NFC chip of your device, or you want, your messaging app to access the camera function on your device when you do a live call, for an example, right? So, and then depending on the incentives, it's all about incentives. The company can limit the type of interoperability, right? So we had in the past Apple blocking access to NFC chip, to blocking software interoperability, for example, to the term functions controlled by iOS that they don't want others to access. So this is very important. Last but not least, the DMA. It's about also. It's a huge law, and not everything is relevant for free software, right? Because there are a lot of things regarding social media. There are things regarding, anti-steering provisions, search engines, how search should be located. So there's a huge group of obligations. But for us, for free software, free and open source software, this basically what I just mentioned: the interoperability, the installation of obligations, data portability, real-time stream of data, which we call data interoperability. These are the bulk of obligations that are interesting for us.
Got it. And so now the great question is, what parts of the DMA do you guys disagree with? What do you think is not good and you're fighting to make it better? And then, of course, what is good? What are you guys really hugely in support of, and why?
The whole debate of the DMA in the beginnings in 2021 and even today, it's pretty much oriented towards industry, larger industry, not big tech, but larger industry. So when you interact with decision makers, be it the European Parliament or the European Commission, they come already with a mindset, more or less, that the solutions that the DMA should provide is for big industry, not big tech like the size or scale of Google or Apple, but a large industry, a large company with hundreds of employees. And here, this is our first disagreement with the DMA, because we do believe that the DMA should treat also smaller players, individual developers, non-profit, SMEs, startups, with the same level of respect, if you will, with the big industry. Because in the end, software industry in Europe, and I would like to stress this, is small tech. There was a research in 2022 when there was also a very big law in recently that this law also catch the attention of the free software community, which was the Cyber Resilience Act, which imposed differently from the DMA. That DMA does not impose any type of obligations on smaller providers, but the CRA there were some obligations that also or cyber security obligations that are imposed on smaller providers. And in this law, there was a research involved on this, a big research, that 94% of the software industry in the EU is done by SMEs with less than 9 employees. So software is developed by small tech in Europe. This is a fact. It's a plethora of small organizations, groups of people, individual developers that are developing software. So in this sense, our first disagreement some years ago with the DMA was not to include on the text of the law even more, stronger interoperability obligations that would contemplate these smaller players. I'll give a very concrete example. When the DMA established an obligation for an interoperability solution, the providers, for example, WhatsApp for messaging apps, or Google for Android, or Apple for App Store, they are not obliged to use open standards. If they wanted to use their own standards, they can do so under the condition that it should be under fair and reasonable terms, right? But there is no obligation proposing open standards. And I'm sad about this because I do think it was a great opportunity, a missed opportunity for us to implement a tech that is interoperable by design when we have open standards, when we don't have copyrights, patents in the way to impose and to create a new tech that is more democratic, distributed, that is aligned with the principles of free and open source. So every time that we needed to propose a solution when we are engaged in the DMA, we need to remember this, and we need to remind the policymakers that, look, when we establish a solution, it's not only for big players. And I will give a very concrete example for you. Last year, we were involved in the discussion about enabling alternative app stores in iOS. Until today, there is no independent app store in iOS. There is OutStore. Everybody knows and loves OutStore. They are great guys, but they are still not independent. Apple still controls how you sideload, how you install apps on iOS. They imposed via notarization. It's called notarization. This process of app review. The entire review of apps are not done independently, like in Google, for example, right? It's done,
or even Mac OS,
Apple, or in Mac OS, perfectly, perfectly. This is crazy, right? So when we were fighting this, and we are fighting, we submitted, we helped civil society organizations to submit a formal complaint to the European Commission to enable sideloading, to enable alternative app stores in iOS. When we were fighting about this, we told the European Commission that, look, we needed to contemplate smaller, developers like F-Droid, because the bigger app stores, the bigger commercial proprietary app stores in Europe, they would be okay in just paying less fees for Apple. And if Apple could also retain the control, but just for them to pay lower fees, that would be okay. But we went further, much further, saying, look, only paying lower fees is not good for us. It's not good. If it is good for industry, this is not good for civil society. This is not good for smaller free and open source projects. We really need to disentangle the control from side loading, the control for enabling independent app stores in iOS and Android. So this is an example that things that we don't like too much in the DMA. It's oriented toward industries, and then when there is a solution, may I give another example?
Of course. The examples are good. They make it a lot more tangible.
Yeah. So in the beginning of this year, we criticized also. We work very close with the Commission, and we are very appreciated that they hear our positions. But we put ourselves also in the position of a watchdog. Like, as I said, there is good and bad regulation. When the regulation is good, we applaud, but when the regulation is not good, we complain. So in the beginning of this year, we were involved in an investigation. Well, the term is not investigation, but a specification. The European Commission started to investigate how Apple was dealing in, this type of interoperability blocks that I mentioned, not allowing access to camera, not allowing access to NFC chip. And they opened two specification procedures, well, basically regulatory procedures against Apple for hardware and software interoperability, right? And we took part on the software interoperability one. Other guys took part also in the hardware interoperability, but we worked with the Commission on the software interoperability, and we urged the Commission to establish interoperability by design. So I said this is a great opportunity to impose interoperability by design in Apple. So what do we mean by interoperability by design? Unfettered side loading. Let's make iOS as macOS. People can just download things from the internet, install alternative operating systems. No need to this app review. Of course, if Apple wants to retain control on App Store, fine, it's their right, it's their App Store, they can do so. But if end users want to install an alternative App Store, then, like F-Droid, they can do so, distribute security checks over different App Stores, right? So this would be some of examples of interoperability by design. When Apple should use the same APIs or provide the same internal APIs that they use, and they should document this publicly. So they use the same type of APIs that third parties can also use. They should document their APIs. They should document how access is provided for cameras, for NFC chips, and etc. Right? Basically, how this is also done in Android, and this is key. And that they do not need necessarily to give away their intellectual property. They can develop interoperability solutions that they do not necessarily to give away their intellectual property. It is completely possible to do via open standards, for an example, right? Well, that's all good and dandy. But then when the Commission finalized the decision, they didn't impose this on Apple. They didn't impose interoperability by design. Instead, they agreed with Apple that Apple has a very complex system for requiring interoperability. So the developer should create an account with Apple, pay 99 euros for the development account, and then they should submit their request. Their request should be like literally bureaucratic process. They should write everything. Then there is a committee from Apple that will decide on this, and then if the committee doesn't agree, there is a second instance, and then the developer goes to the second instance, and then if the second instance also disagree, there is how it's called, a conciliation procedure where a third party comes. Very bureaucratic, very bureaucratic, but for industry, they are accustomed to this, the big industry, and they have resource to do this. Startups, SMEs, individual developers, they don't have this. So we criticize this. We were not happy with that, So on a general level, now, because just to summarize this very long answer, and I apologize for this. You said, what is the stance of the DMA, right? I remain optimistic because I do think that we are moving towards more open kind of tech, more interoperable. There are these hiccups. Yes, I just mentioned some of them. No open standards, some bureaucratic process to get interoperability. Yeah, but this is normal because, big tech is fighting seriously against the DMA. So compromises are a natural process in democracy. But in general, I do think that the DMA has a huge potential to grow and to make tech more interoperable by design and more open.
So the actually, before I ask this question, USB-C on iPhones. Apple will never admit this, ever, 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 but I am still, and I'm sure a lot of people agree that the EU is the reason we finally got USB-C on iPhones, because this was an EU mandate, and I don't think Apple wanted to deal with shipping two different versions of iPhones, but now they kind of are with the whole SIM thing, because you guys still require physical SIM cards, the US does not, so Apple's completely dropped SIM cards, now we have two different versions of iPhones. Is the USB-C thing part of anything we're talking about?
I mean...
or is it different?
No, it is part, but the only difference here is on the time frame. The USB-C was a little bit earlier than the DMA, but the type of discussion on USB-C is precisely the type of hardware interoperability that we are talking about. Nowadays,
was this the DMA? Was it the DSA? What?
No, it was not the DMA. Oh my God, I was involved with this several years ago, but my memory is killing me. It was a directive that intended to regulate chargers in the US. In the EU. So it was around 2021. So it was before the DMA to come into force. But the spirit of this patronization, standardization, is more or less found as well in the DMA. There is this hardware interoperability. Now people are talking about earbuds, interaction with AI, translation things on earbuds in Apple. I'm not following this debate too much because this is a more hardware thingy. But on the hardware side, we are again discussing side loading. We are discussing enabling app stores, enabling alternative browsers, access in operating systems. So this is what is happening more or less on the software side.
Got it. And then, so going back to a bit of the negatives and how Apple is fighting tooth and nail, and this has been the pattern, is Apple has fought almost everything about the DMA as far as I've been able to see. So there's a lot of malicious compliance. That's kind of the word I've been seeing a lot, kind of define what Apple is doing here. Where is this shortcoming coming from? Do you see this as a natural part? You mentioned that there are some natural things that happen of this process. Is that just kind of the expected role that Apple has to play? Does it mean that the DMA is too aggressive? Does it mean the DMA isn't aggressive enough? Just kind of what are your views on Apple's malicious compliance approach to everything that's been imposed on them?
Yes, I heard this term malicious compliance as well. I'm not sure if I agree 100% with this because, this is the problem. When we have compliance, right? But this is a different topic, and I don't think this. So to answer precisely your question, I'm a lawyer as education. I studied in Brazil. I'm a lawyer in Brazil, and here in Europe, I'm an academic, and also I work for the FSFE. But my mindset, the way that I see the world, is more or less like the lawyers see the world. and there are always two versions, right? There are always two versions when we are applying a law. Think about family law. There are always the version of the husband. There are always the version of the wife. There's the version of the kid, right? This is the beauty of the law, but this is also the shortcomings of the law. This is and if you ask me as a representative of the Free Software Foundation Europe how I interpret Article 6.7 of the DMA, I will give you an interpretation. Now, if you invite Apple's lawyer, they're based in Dublin, I think. You call them and say, look, can you give me the interpretation of Article 6.7 of the DMA? They will give a completely different interpretation, because this is how law works, right? And therefore, when Commission ask or impose an obligation to Apple, Apple will comply as they see fit. They say, look, this is my way of doing compliance. Now, it's the role of the regulators, it's the role of civil society, it's the role of competitors to say, look, the way that Apple is complying is really bad. It's malicious compliance. We should not comply this way. In the end, then the regulator or the court has to say, yes, indeed, Apple was wrong. So this dialectical process is a natural phenomenon. That's why I said, while we are in a democracy, we have to deal with this dialectics of law. The problem with when we have monopolies in the market is that, well, in the sense, compliance become easier because then we have just one view of the law. But then the problem of monopolies in the law is more or less is non-democratic societies. In non-democratic societies, we have just the view of the government. With a monopoly in the digital markets, we have just the view of one corporation. Both are corporations, government or a corporation. So when we are coming into a democratic process that we need to comply with the law, then Apple will come and say, this is my interpretation. And then the FSFE as a civil society will come and say, this is our interpretation. And the commission should come with a solution. We complain when the commission takes Apple's view more more correctly, if we will, than ours. Then we say, no, look, there's this reason that you should reconsider, right? But when they accept our vision, then we're happy.
Perfect. Yeah, so now I kind of want to zoom out a little bit here, and I apologize if you're going to have to explain some basic, perhaps elementary school, middle school EU stuff here. But it's kind of funny, when you're based in the US, it seems like a lot of the world has kind of been imposed. There's this expectation that if you're outside the US, there's some basic things about the US you have to know. But if you live in the US, it doesn't go back the other way. So I still have some confusion, but I know a lot of people in the US have some confusion over what is the EU as a whole, right? Because, and it can be kind of confusing to outsiders because we have things like the DMA that can be seen as a big win for digital rights. I know not everything's quite positive about it, like we talked about, but we also see, chat control come out of the EU. And I know that's kind of tapered down a little bit. It seems like it's at least temporarily paused, but we also see this omnibus happening tomorrow. They're releasing the paperwork for it, and we're kind of waiting to see if it's good, bad, etc. But overall, the draft that was leaked was very negative. We also, because it'll weaken GDPR a bit, but then we have great things like the DMA. So can you just briefly explain how the government is structured, where the regulation comes from, and just just general explain it like I'm 5 to someone who's outside of the EU, so they can kind of understand the political nuances here of what is the EU.
Yes. All right. So before we enter a little bit into the structure of the EU, so we can understand how the legislative process happened, it's a little bit hard, just as a very zoom out, perspective, to have a general moral judgment on the EU itself. It's very hard to say, look, sometimes the EU have bad regulations, sometimes have good regulation. This is normal to, at least in my humble perspective, to any government. and that's why we have the shift of governments, 4 years, because it's good for governments to change. So we have some fresh air coming sometimes, right? You gave two examples, chat control, a bad thing, and even before chat control, we had already some other type of regulations that were really, really bad. I would say that one of the first regulations to tackle copyright in the first place, back in the 90s, I don't think that it was a very good, wise decision to start regulating digital with copyright. But this is a topic perhaps for another meeting. Very shortly about the EU. The EU is a form of government. There are some countries which the government is a king, like in the UK, or a queen. I'm sorry, right? There, it's so basically they have the monarchy, right? In other countries, well, they have a president, right, which is democratic elected. In other countries, they have a dictator, which is not democratic elected, but is there. The guy or the woman is governing, right? And the EU is also a form of government. And it was achieved because the European countries, after World War II, they said, look, perhaps we need to put our differences aside and perhaps we need to work together to a common goal. The regions of the EU, it's very beautiful because then it was France and Germany coming together and to make peace and say, look, what we need to avoid two world wars, the First World War and the Second War, because they were deeply involved in this, right? And they came with an idea to say, look, perhaps we need to share our most important resources, the resources that we use to build weapons. It is coal and steel. And then they created an organization to use commonly, to share coal and steel. And there it was the infancy, the emergence of the European Union. And then it was increasing the type of organization that became, it started with this cooperation in the area of coal and steel, right? But it started to grow and grow to the extent that basically all of types of industry are now regulated, and several other elements are being regulated in what we call a supranational government. So there are two levels of government. There is the union level, European Union level, but also there is the level of governments, government of France, government of Germany, government of Portugal, government of Ireland, right? But in the term cases, they come together and they agree and they say, look, this should apply to everyone. And then when they agree, there is a regulation or there is a directive.
Yeah, I think that's a really good overview. And then do you mind explaining, like the EU Commission versus some of the other organizations that kind of make up the EU? I think there's, because, we have like the executive branch, then we have Congress, and then we have the judiciary. And you guys have your own pretty similar version of that I think is good to explain, and kind of who handles what kind of thing in the scope of what we're discussing today.
Absolutely. The history of the US is also very beautiful because the US consolidated this division of power that was thought in France during the French Revolution. We are talking 300 years ago, when France, they were sick about the medieval times where the kings ruled together with the church, and they said, look, perhaps we need to think about a republic, a more democratic view. And they came. There are several philosophers, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and several of these very known philosophers, which thought that, okay, how we should organize this government. I told you that European Union is a government. As in the US, we have a presidential type of government, right? In the EU, we also have a government here. But 300 years ago, some guys in France thought how we should organize government, how we should, empower people in a democratic way. And then they came with the idea of branches, as you just mentioned, right? They think, okay, so we need someone to produce the law. So they should write the law. And this would be the Congress, the legislative branch of the power. Okay, good. Then we need someone to apply this law, but this should not be the same person, right? Okay, so when the law is ready, we need to give this law to another person. And this person is the executive branch, the one who executes the law, the president, right? And then in the end, when someone has a problem with the law itself, perhaps we need a third person to decide on the law. And this is the judiciary. These are the courts, right? So in the US, we have the Supreme Court, we have, the executive branch, and then we have also the Congress. In the EU is the same, absolutely the same. We have the European Commission, which is the branch, the executive branch. We don't have a president, but we have a commissioner from the lion. The name is different, but it's more or less the same. We have the European Parliament, which is, again, as the US Congress, and there we have parties and we have representatives. In the US, in the Congress, we have representatives of the state, right? In the US, we have representatives of the countries, but the system is the same, more or less. The principles are the same. And then, last but not least, we have the Supreme Court in the US, and we have here the European Court of Justice. To give a concrete example, how the DMA works on this. So in 2020, in the end of 2020, the European Parliament came with the law. Said, look, we need to start approving this law. Then it took some time. And now I don't remember precisely when the law was passed into law. I think it was the end of 2022. But then there was a period for the law to apply, to start being applied. It was at the beginning of 2024. Then it means like now the European Commission can start applying the law, right? So the European Commission started these investigations and it started putting fines. But this law was prepared, was written by the European Parliament, right? Now, one of the first things that, the European Commission did was to call Apple and say, Apple, now the DMA will start applying to you. And what Apple did, I don't agree. And then Apple went to the European Court of Justice, so the third branch, and they say, look, we are against this law and we don't agree with the opinion of the European Commission. And they started to litigate against the European Commission in the judiciary branch. So yeah, this is more or less how this works.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I know that can probably put the final piece of the puzzle together for a lot of people who don't understand how the EU works, including myself as well. So the last thing I want to ask you before I kind of just open it up to anything that you think we may have missed. I've been seeing a lot of similar things to the DMA start to pop up around the world. Do you want to speak to maybe the global influence that the DMA has, that you've seen it having?
Yes. So I think the moment that we are living now with the DMA is like a historical spiral, that we saw in the end of the 70s. In the 70s, today everybody literally in the EU is talking about digital sovereignty, as something that is modern and something that is emerged. People are talking about digital sovereignty since 2018 here in Europe. But I would like to have a historical detour a little bit. In the end of the 70s. In the end of the 70s, a lot of people were discussing data sovereignty. And who are these a lot of people? Basically, countries in Africa, in Latin America, and Southeast Asia that they were just leaving colonization because European countries, they had colonies. Portugal had colonies, France had colonies, Belgium had colonies, the Netherlands had colonies, all over the world. And after World War II, when there was this process of decolonization, especially in Africa and Southeast Asia, remember, Vietnam was a colony of France, Angola was a colony of Portugal, Mozambique as well, right? And when these countries started to become independent and they started thinking about organize the government, just like we just said, 300 years ago, it was France thinking about organizing the government. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, what France thought and started to implement with Napoleon was consolidate in the US with the founding fathers, right? So the US has a very important history in democracy in role because they consolidated this, right? Fast forwarding 300 years forward. In the 70s, these countries, Angola, Mozambique, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and many others, they were thinking how we should organize our countries. And then they realized that the communications infrastructure that they had in place, the antennas, the channels in TV, the channels in radio, they were dominated by these companies from the colonies themselves. So they said, how should we enforce sovereignty in our country when our whole communications infrastructure is being detained by foreign companies? And they started to think about sovereignty in relation to data sovereignty. Well, nowadays we are thinking about digital sovereignty, and this is more or less what is happening in Europe. But this process, although we are very EU focused, this is a natural process happening elsewhere. And I give several examples. Japan just passed a very similar legislation like the DMA. South Korea passed a legislation that is also similar to DMA. Australia has started to reform its competition law with similarities, to incorporate some similarities of the DMA. South Africa and also Japan contact F-Droid, for an example, on their views on alternative app stores. Brazil just recently, really recently, last month, started also to have a law to regulate internet platforms in the content layer and also in the infrastructure layer. So Canada is also thinking about this as well. And the United States is also not an exception. And in 2016, 2018, there were also some movements in order to start thinking about regulating big tech. Professor Tim Wu, Lina Han, there were some names that were involved in this process in the United States as well. So this is the type of, that's why I said this is a historical spiral, right? Because then we had this in the 70s, then in the middle of the 90s, and now it coming back now in the 2020s as well, a natural process when people start thinking about monopolies. At that time in the 70s, it was telecommunications monopolies over the TV channel, monopolies over the radio spectrum. Today we have monopolies in the digital sphere, and now it's natural for people to start thinking it in Europe or elsewhere.
Got it. Very, very nice global view on things. And I really appreciate the insight on that. Do you feel like, there's something that I haven't touched on in this interview that is important to mention to our audience?
I just wanted to say that I didn't give too much, concrete examples on these interpretations of the law from big tech. I gave some examples, but I would like to expand this a little bit, just to give a little bit more context, also to how other companies, not only Apple, are dealing with this. Recently, the FSFE was involved. Let's start with Google. Recently, the FSFE was involved in a formal complaint against Google because Google has a different interpretation of the word uninstalling software on their devices. If you have an Android device yourself, and it's not the Googleized, you have a stock Android, you're going to see that there's a lot of pre-installed apps, right? There's this suite of apps that are pre-installed. And according to the DMA, there are some dispositions there that end users should uninstall software and they can back to default settings. Well, Google came with different interpretations of the meaning uninstalling. Sometimes it's disabling, sometimes it's deleting, sometimes it's uninstalling. So we filed a formal complaint asking that uninstalling should be deleting. So we want to remove the app from our devices, right? You said you covered the F-Droid case about the DAP certification, right? Tomorrow I'm traveling to Brussels because we are also involved in a study that the developer certification is the pinnacle of a series of, and I think you covered also very nicely in your channel about the other restrictions that Google imposed on alternative Android ROMs, right? So when they started to provide device trees, the drivers with the release of the Android 16 source code, right? And we also think that some of these restrictions are not compliant with the DMA. And we are going to Brussels tomorrow and to discuss with the European Commission that the release of device trees, the release of drivers for Pixel's devices is very important to this ecosystem around Android. There are millions of people, literally millions of people using Lineage OS, AOS, Graphene OS, and they depend on this privacy and security-oriented alternative ROMs for the work. Think about journalists. Think about people involved with protection of human rights. They need to have a secure phone, and they don't have the money to buy Apple. Apple is very expensive, so they buy an Android phone. And when they have the possibility to install an alternative ROM, this is crucial for them, to have more secure and more privacy-oriented solutions. So we think that alternative ROMs play a very important role in the digital ecosystem. And we are going there to say that Google is not complying with interoperability obligations of the DMA. So this is also for Google, right? Regarding Apple, we talk a lot about app stores, but the FSFE is also involved in strategic litigation against Apple. And we are helping the European Commission because I gave this example of the Commission calling Apple saying, the DMA will apply to you. And then Apple said, we don't agree, we go to the court. And they went to the court, and and I'll give what they are claiming in the court. They say that the Commission was wrong to designate their app store because they don't have one app store. They have 5 app stores. Apple is saying they have an app store for iOS, for iPad OS, for Mac OS, for Apple TV, and I think for also iWatch, I think. So, yeah, and they go to the court and claim this type of things, and then the commission has to prove that although they have 5 different app stores, it's all one service, So, and then we went to the court and look, this is not only thing that is being discussed on the court. Apple is also claiming that the interoperability obligations, that's why I mentioned that it is possible to implement interoperability that does not necessarily impact on intellectual property, because Apple is claiming that interoperability expropriates their intellectual property rights. They say that interoperability is really, really bad for their patents and copyrights and trademarks, etc. And we have our lawyer. It's an awesome lawyer. He's a professor in London, Dr. Martin Huzovic. It's pretty much involved with platform regulation and free software. And he developed a whole thesis. It's on our website, if your audience wanted to read about this, where it's a beautiful piece. And he says, as soon as society grows in complexity, interoperability becomes inevitable. And he told a very touching and moving history of a fire in Baltimore, if I'm not mistaken, the city in the United States, in the beginning of the century, when a fire erupted across the city, and the local firemen, they were not able to put out the fire, and they had to call fire brigades from other cities. And when the fire brigades from other cities arrived in Baltimore, they realized that the equipment was not interoperable with the water houses there, and they had to watch the city to burn in front of their eyes. So, he explained this in our submission to the court to say, look, interoperability is really important for communication. Interoperability is key to enable the exchange of human knowledge. And therefore, we need to regulate these companies from the perspective of public interest. Public interest should be our goal. And therefore, we are interacting on the court for this. So I would like just to give some context, right, to show that, there's a huge array of activities that we are being involved with decision makers in order to make the DMA free software developer friendly. So we want the DMA to be friendly to free software developers. This is our main goal.
Got it. Well, you guys, I know it's probably a bit of a hidden battle. I feel like it's kept a lot from the public eye, and most normal people don't know about what's going on, but I know they feel the impacts, and I know I can speak on behalf of a lot of people that your work is much appreciated on this, and I hope that it really pushes tech in a good direction in the coming years. Yeah, that's all I have for this interview. I especially want to thank you for your time. and just being here today and talking about this, and hopefully us talking about these issues puts it a little bit more in the public eye, and more people who might not know what's going on or they don't know all the details got a lot more context today. So just thank you for your time, and thank you for everything you guys are doing to fight for digital rights.
Harry, it's a great pleasure. I sincerely thank you for opening this channel. It's a great pleasure. I thank you. I thank your audience. You do an awesome job in spreading this knowledge in YouTube platforms and other platforms. So this is really great. Appreciate. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucas.
And that is the episode. I will leave everything down in a description for you all to dive a little bit deeper and take some action for some of the things that Lucas has talked about. I know I learned a crap ton of stuff from this interview, and I know I'm not the only one. So I really want to thank Lucas for coming out there, taking his time to educate all of us on what's going on with the DMA and how we can get better active with it. If you enjoy Techlore Talks, it wouldn't be possible without our amazing community members who support what we're doing. And I call them the Techlorians, and that's because they're out there and they're part of our exclusive communities, they're getting exclusive perks, and they're also making this kind of information freely available to the public. So we really couldn't do it without them. You can join yourself down in the description, and that keeps us growing to reach more and more people. I also realized that Techlore Talks has a lot less ratings and kind of engagement than Surveillance Support does, even though there's still a lot of listeners on Techlore Talks. So if you do listen to Techlore Talks, please, it's a really free and easy way to support the podcast. Leave a rating, leave a comment, share it around with people you know. Just do what you can to engage with it. It really does help reach, and I'd love to see more people getting a hold of this vital information. See you all next time on Techlore.